Well, hey, everybody. Welcome. We're back for another episode of the Ship Show series. Today's Thursday, August 17th, 2023. And this is episode 30 in our yearly series. And this week, everybody, it's all about the FMR, the Freight Market Roundup. So let's dive right into it. And let me welcome my amazing co-host, Jason Brand. Jason, what's happening and what's going on?
Not much. We just have a downpour here, so it's got me all stressed about my basement, but Michigan basements all around. But anyways, I hope everyone's having a great day, and we've got people that join all over. So, good afternoon. Thank you for joining. Good morning. If it's your morning, thank you so much for joining. My name is Jason Brand. I'm the Director of Outreach and Partner Development here at Supply Chain Solutions. Every week, I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Anthony D'Ambrosio. He's the Vice President of Sales. If you're a returning viewer of our weekly ship show, thank you so much for tuning in today. And if you're new to the show, thank you so much. We're on live every week, Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern. Every other week, we hit the Freight Market Roundup. The weeks in between, we either have a special guest on or we do a deep dive into a topic that's, popular to make sure that people understand the roots of what's happening and, just to help everyone get a little bit more educated in the realm of supply chain, especially right now, because there's a lot of opportunity. So, Supply Chain Solutions, who are we? So it's our goal to essentially provide our customers with a truly one-stop shop for every bit of your logistics needs. And that can include our end-to-end shipping services that are to more than 160 different countries, or that can be including access to our expansive warehouse network. And that's actually a multi-continental network. So keep that in mind. Also, we've got a newly integrated technology solution that essentially takes all these supply chain challenges and sourcing decisions and makes it a lot easier for you to see the components and the things that really matter. So our all-in-one solution brings together our transportation management tools, our inventory management tools, our document management tools, and our data management tools, all into a custom designed single sign-on for you and your team. We'll walk through an implementation. We can set up different dashboards for different levels of your organization, making sure you guys are focused on the right thing and you've got your KPIs set up and everything. So you know how to manage us when we need to be managed. But generally speaking, we can give you some tips and tricks how to ship better and more effectively, especially this year. Anyways, Anthony mentioned that today is our Freight Market Roundup, and it totally is. But I have to cram in a little bit more of that H1 session we had last week because there's just a lot of stuff for the state of the industry we got to talk about. And we didn't get to LTL. And it's been a little bit of a hot topic lately. I'm not sure if you've seen the news, but let's dive in. Let's talk about it a little bit. And then we'll move on to our regular rate trends and discussion. So if you've been living under a rock, Yellow Corp has officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Now, that actually happened on Sunday, August 6th. And it's a big moment. It's marking the demise of a nearly century-old carrier, and they grew into an LTL giant. And the general consensus is that through a series of acquisitions, they didn't succeed in fully integrating, which essentially led to their downfall. So Yellow has come close to folding really 4 other times, and this goes all the way back to the Great Recession. Great Recession, keep that in mind. It's not all the way back. Still a long time in supply chain years, in my years as well. But this included also during the pandemic, right? There was a crisis which happened across all supply chains, definitely hit Yellow very hard. They took a $700 million bailout from the U.S. Treasury, and that was part of a COVID relief aid package. But the problem with that is the Treasury became the largest shareholder in this process, and it made the government a key creditor for the whole bankruptcy proceedings. Now, in this bankruptcy announcement, Yellow actually specifically pointed the finger at the International Brotherhood of Teamsters for their demise. And they essentially said the union had obstructed the One Yellow network overhaul, and it cost the company more than $100 million in profit losses from the delays. So coming directly from Hawkins, basically it said, we face 9 months of union getting involvement, bullying, and deliberately destructive tactics. And he went on to say that a company has the right to manage its own operations, but as we have experienced, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters leadership was able to halt their business plan and literally drive their company out of business despite every effort to work with them. Now, obviously, some very, very strong words. Anthony and I have worked with Yellow for a very long time. We've heard a lot of different sides of this. We've also seen a lot of union contract negotiations. And this one, quite frankly, well, it technically was not a contract renegotiation. This happened off contract year. It was a forced change going on with Yellow where they were trying to, dramatically change their network. But this was a pretty ugly one, in our opinion. It hit the news, and there was a lot of intense rhetoric. Let's put it that way. Anthony, how are you feeling about all this so far? How are you feeling kind of about on Yellow and the situation?
Well, I tell you, it's really a mess. And, there was some great articles that segued into the Yellow situation today. And they really went on to say that we don't expect to see a U.S. freight rebound until 2024.
Yeah.
And, even though that inflation is falling a little bit and the economy is expanding somewhat, a lot further than I think even our own economists anticipated, the freight demand, especially in the FTL and the LTL, which we're talking about now, LTL, isn't rebounding quick enough. So, instead, the freight downturn that began in the fall of 2022 is likely going to last through the end of the year for the U.S. trucking sector. And I think supply chain overall, even on the ocean freight side, which we'll talk about later. But from everything that, I've been studying, that Jason's been studying and researching, this is really going to stretch into the second quarter of 2024. And, we think that the truckload spot market really hit the bottom, but, we're not really sure. Sometimes we feel real good about it, and then some other new news comes out, emerging trend, and, it's just a real fly in the ointment right now. So I think we're set up to start a recovery, but I really believe that it's probably at least 2 or maybe 3 quarters of, away from really fully recovering, Jay.
Yeah, I love that you called out fall 2022 as the demise, because it really was. That missed peak season spelled the disaster for, really up to this point. And we've got a missed peak season happening right now. And we're really not expecting any surge in freight. Obviously, we've got the little holidays, and also capacity has been really controlled, specifically when you look at the ocean environment. So even though it might be challenging to get your booking, that's mainly because a lot of those capacity levers are getting pulled in the direction to make that the case. So yeah, and honestly, I think what's interesting about, when we think about the freight market and kind of their little recession that's happened since fall of last year, and we also think about how LTL fits in this equation, what is going to be challenging for a lot of carriers is that Yellow, or excuse me, not a lot of carriers, a lot of shippers, is that Yellow was the discount carrier. We use them quite often. We knew how to work with Yellow in a way to get the service we needed, and also to provide for our customers a rate that was extremely effective. Obviously, a lot of the LTL carriers have their lanes they're awesome in, but the thing about Yellow is generally you could get a good rate across the board, and it also kept the market in check. When you lose this discount carrier, you lose that carrier almost bringing rates down slightly. So as a result, you're really going to be seeing likely some sticker shock in the LTL realm, because the bottom is now higher, and as a result, the higher is now higher. Obviously, is supply and demand, but it's beyond that. It's just you've got a low cost carrier that doesn't exist anymore. So you got to keep that in mind as well.
And one last thing, Jay, before you go on about that, when you think about it, the U.S. truck volumes are down 2% in 2023. Now, it's a seasonally adjusted number, and it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you actually look at some of the, the graphs and things like that, I mean, it's a really big downturn. And, when you combine a 2% decrease in the per ton mile activity with a 3 to 4% increase in the trucking employment market, it's a real recipe for a soft market. And then, Yellow goes bankrupt and just blows everything up. So, Jason's spot on. I think we're going to see the pricing go up the rest of this year and into next year.
And if you just think about supply chain 101 with this situation, right? If you are a shipper and you've been managing all of your freight, and a lot of your freight's LTL, and this information, this is an excellent time to start using a 3PL, because this is an opportunity you can have to mingle your freight with other customers' freight to be able to capture what's happening in the divergence of both of these markets when you've got your full truckload going down in cost and your LTL going up in cost. So just make sure, if you're doing all the management yourself, you ship a lot of LTL, this is probably a great time to talk to a third-party logistics provider to be able to kind of just start to consolidate some of that. I mean, it is an opportunity to save some money this year.
Yeah, and Jay, just great point. I mean, when you think about supply chain solutions with our power, our leverage in the LTL and the FTL market, with $75 million of freight under our control and with our various contracts, it's a win-win. So, great point, Jay.
Yeah, honestly. I want to make one final point on this, because I do think this kind of finger pointing at the union is pretty interesting, because obviously I'm going to use the word clapped back. The union clapped back at him, but and they made some excellent points. I actually don't have their direct quote in my notes, but they essentially said, look, Yellow's been close to failing a lot of times. We've made concessions during our negotiations a lot of times. Like, it's not their fault that they couldn't figure out how to run their business. Obviously, we Anthony and I have gone, we've seen a lot of these union negotiations. We know this one was very ugly. I think there's a chance it could have been avoidable. One of the things that we can point to from just like a data point that can, in personal opinion, kind of put the blame on the union is when they threatened to strike, Yellow lost 80% of the freight in their network. So just that threat made all the customers run away, and that essentially sealed the casket. So, at least in my opinion, what happens with the ILWU, even though that is definitely not a example union negotiation, but what happened with their union negotiation, generally things would be under the radar for a long time, and then they bubble up over the top. I'm sure that would have still happened here, even if it still was under the radar, but I think less press could have maybe not spooked as many shippers, and as a result, maybe they could have pulled out of it. There was almost a final situation where, it was looking like they might make it, and then, obviously they missed their second pension payment. Also, the threat of the strike really kind of put that nail in. But yeah, so I'm going to move right on, because we've got a couple internal updates that got sent out from our team, and I want to run through them. It is pretty interesting what's going on in the markets right now in particular, but you'd expect it because we are, past peak season, and the businesses were really telling all of their shareholders, or at least the carriers were, that, hey, we'll make up all these losses at the end of the year, and it's not looking like it's going to be that way for them in particular. Now, yeah, really, unfortunately, well, I was going to say unfortunately, Anthony, but obviously, we'd like to change in the ocean shipping environment. Anyway, so okay, obviously LTL, we just opened a lot of rabbit holes. We'll start to bury those or dig them deeper. How you guys please, how would you like us to? So leave a comment or shoot us an email and let us know anything else you'd like us to kind of consider when it comes to LTL, or any strategy kind of questions you'd like to know going forward. Now, let's quick talk specifically about our Trans-Pacific. Let's get into our regular freight market roundup. So how this is going to work is we're going to run through our ocean lanes. Then we're going to talk about what's going on with the rates, what the rate trend is. We're going to move into a couple current events, and then we're going to move into our air freight market, and then we're going to talk about oil and gas. So starting with our Trans-Pacific, with our Trans-Pacific lanes, we're looking specifically at importing into the U.S. We're focusing right now on the West Coast, and it's going to be coming out of the Southeast Asia, China region. Quick reminder here, when we're talking about these rates, we're talking about just the ocean portion of the rates. We're not talking about the inland portions. Obviously, if you've been shipping a lot in these lanes, those can vary quite a bit. The ocean portion is a pretty good barometer, so we like to talk about those. If you can't see your ocean portion, then you have a big problem, and you got to reach out to us so we can at least help you control some costs, because your costs should be pretty manageable right now when it comes to ocean shipping. Anyway, yeah, I mean, totally. So Anthony and I mentioned this last week, but we are expecting a lot of GRIs, and not only GRIs, but I'll get into that in a minute. So you can expect these rate levels to be elevated in the short and near term because of this, but I'm not expecting the rate level to be elevated for too long. So right now, as of the end of last week, we were locking in shipments for 1,900 a TEU. And, they've been buoyed, specifically these rates on the West Coast, because of a series of reasons. But one big reason is we still have the labor unions going at it on the East Coast. This is the same thing that happened on the flip direction when the West Coast ILWU was getting into their contract negotiations. Things were getting heated. Everyone shifted their volume to Houston and also up the East Coast as well. But on top of that ILWU situation, we've had some dilemmas in the Panama. So as a result, not all the volume can go to these other ports, at least as cost effectively as it needs to be. And also, as a result, some of the shippers who just normally would need to ship to Houston or your East Coast ports are shipping to the West Coast ports right now. So there's a little bit of volume buoying going on, but there also is a situation with these GRIs. Anthony, you want to run through some stuff before I dive into some of those internal notes?
Yeah, just, I think one of the most important things, that we really need to think about right now is, of course, you have your NVOCCs, which, of course, Supply Chain Solutions and NVOCC. But we're finding that the carriers are not really honoring any fixed rates for NVOCCs. In our New Jersey operation, we had a large client some years ago, and they wanted a fixed rate. They had a high volume of containers, and this was prior pandemic, and we were able to get a really nice fixed rate for them. But, unless you're a BCO and you're a beneficiary cargo owner, they're not fixing rates. Mm-hmm. So, I think we're going to see this trend keep going all through the fall and into the winter and into Chinese New Year's with these GRIs, Jay.
This is a big frustration of mine, because we saw an ugly contract season for the ocean carriers, and it should have been, because during the pandemic there was no honoring of contracts. It was, you sell too many seats on an airplane. Is the passenger supposed to be the one that gets screwed? And we're during the pandemic, we just saw the whole system collapse, right? Because we had the delays, the massive influx of cargo. I don't want to get into all the reasons. That is a different show. But so we come out of the pandemic, we come out of this surplus of cargo, we get back to the negotiating table, and you've got shippers that are agreeing to pay more than the spot market because they're trying to be a fair negotiator and not lock in something that's not sustainable. They're trying to be realistic. But that's not even being honored right now. So as a result, it's a bit frustrating personally to me. Anyway.
Yeah, and Jay, just before you go into that point, think about it, folks, driven by the strength of the U.S. consumer spending trends, which is, not what it used to be prior to the pandemic, and the ongoing reductions in the capacity, like Jason was saying, carriers have announced these GRIs across all lanes. So, until, even though inflation's coming down and, the economy is expanding somewhat, until the consumer starts spending again.
Yep.
And buying TVs and, cars and this and that, we're not going to see it come back. But back to you, Jay. I know you have some really good stuff you want to dive into.
That is such a spot on point. And actually that event I was at, essentially with that keynote speaker with The Economist, he was driving that point in extremely hard, saying the U.S. consumer buoys the world because we buy so much. And when we're not buying so much, you see that trickle throughout the world. And, we just really overheated with spending. We overheated. I mean, he had data that he ran through for credit card data. He went data that he ran through for just a number of credit cards. It was just fascinating. But before we dive into the rabbit hole, let me talk a little bit about this. So, what's going on is carriers aren't honoring their fixed rates. Their hands are a little bit tied because GRIs with fixed rates, it's not a situation we can do. So they've got this PSS, essentially peak season surcharge, and they're pushing those out. Obviously, we know there is not a peak season happening right now, and capacity is being very controlled at the moment. So it's a little frustrating. But so these peak season surcharges are happening almost across the board. We're expecting them to last for 4 to 6 weeks. Let me run through a couple. So one is applying a peak season surcharge, and remember PSS, peak season surcharge. I'm going to use those interchangeably. And they're applying it in the dollar amount of $200. It's going to be starting on August 19th, and HMM is going to be doing the same, but they're implementing that $200 PSS charge. It's going to be starting on September 1st. CMA is going to be charging $300 for their PSS, and they've actually already begun doing this. The start date was August 15th. Finally, OOCL and Costco are scheduling their PSS to begin on August 25th, and they're also announcing it to be not for $300 but for $200. MSC is not implementing a PSS, but they are kind of working in the spot market in a realm through their contracts. That's, so I don't want to hat off to them essentially. But yeah, so it is also important to note that, despite there being this glut of capacity, that, still our team is saying it's been effective. They have been effective at making the market tight and difficult to ship in, despite this glut of capacity that we have. So, if you're shipping out of, in particular, Central and North China, we're having a little bit of challenges at the moment. When you flip over to South China, actually, it's been a little bit easier. Anthony, I saw you.
No, just I was going to segue into what you said there. I mean, like, you're talking about the peak season, and I don't really think we're in a peak season, but the carriers are calling it a peak season right now, and they're all complaining that they're losing money because demand is down, and they're mothballing fleets. They're taking certain vessels out of certain strings and rotations, and when you think about it, it's really speculative right now. They think this is going to go through September into the fall, into Chinese New Year, but really, what's it depend on, Jay? It depends on that demand, right? So we're going to have to just watch it.
Yeah, this relationship also is based on trust, right? And it gets a little bit frustrating when we're in this kind of, it's just been a bruised relationship, I guess is the best way of putting it. And I'm not exactly sure if this is the best way of going about fixing that bruised relationship. I know as a result of the challenges during the pandemic, a lot of companies decided they didn't want to deal with ocean shipping anymore. And over the course of the pandemic, nearshoring became a huge thing. I mean, Mexico became our number one trading partner. And it's going to continue to be that way, likely, because you can take a link out of the chain. You don't have to deal with a unstable shipping, mechanism, one that can, blow up your costs beyond what you ever thought imaginable, and also completely mess up your lead times. Now, what the ocean carriers really need to do is they need to sell themselves going into the future, and they need to be able to sell the idea of shipping from the other side of the globe as a cost-effective means of doing business. And I don't feel like they're doing a really good job right now at actually accomplishing that mission. I think they're continuing to, they failed, which, unbeknownst to them, the market would swing back in such a hard way, but they need to start laying the ground root of trust and being able to be a plannable, business plannable and business risk controllable means of, operating your business. So, it's a little, Anthony and I could do a whole rant session.
Absolutely.
There's been some very questionable things that have occurred over the years. And so we see sometimes what our customers have had to deal with, and it's just, it stresses us out. Now, a couple things. So, as we're saying, these capacity levers are all being kind of jerked in all different directions. And while space may seem tight, there's one carrier that never planned on banking on fixed rates this year. And that's particularly the Trans-Pacific, and that carrier is ZIM. So ZIM, in a calculated decision, decided, and also ZIM is, you might know them as ZIM Integrated Shipping Services. That's really their official name. But this year, they decided to play in the spot market more than the contract market, with a goal of increasing their exposure, specifically on the Trans-Pacific. Now, high hopes, love mixing it up, but unfortunately, that plan wasn't very fruitful for them at this point, and it didn't prevent another quarterly loss. So before I get into what that quarterly loss was, on the flip side, they are actually well positioned to take advantage of the current spot rate, and the current spot rate market increases. Now, ZIM's spot rate to contract ratio has generally been 50-50. And that, if you look over the past 2 years, has been the case. Now, this year, they decided to shift that to a 70-30, putting 70% in the spot market and 30% in the contract market. So pretty unique decision. Unfortunately, though, ZIM reported an a second consecutive down quarter on Wednesday, and they had a net loss of $213 million. That followed a first quarter loss of $58 million. So they were kind of shooting the moon with the second quarter loss. Now, this is actually, they're the third carrier to report these losses, and Yang Ming was one of them. They lost $4.27 million in the second quarter, and then Wanhai, they had a $72 million loss in that second quarter as well. So Zim had a pretty massive loss. Not getting into the economics of that and actually comparing them apples to apples. So don't essentially make that a race. But this is also coming amidst essentially U.S. imports from Asia seeing double-digit decreases year over year every month since March. July actually came in with another year over year decrease, and that was of negative 10%. So our total TUs coming in were 1.5 million. And remember, this is U.S. imports coming out of Asia. Anthony, anything you want to add to that before I dive into the transatlantic?
No, why don't you go right into the transatlantic? I think you've covered it all. It's, unfortunately, Zim's had a tough year this year. So I think when it's all said and done, they could lose close to $500 million this year before the end of the year. So
yeah,
very sad.
They announced that, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Well, we'll move on past that, but that is
go ahead, my friend.
Yeah. So let's dive into this transatlantic. So there was a quote that came out, and I think this has just been continuously being true week after week after week. So essentially the quote says the party is over on the US East Coast. And that just really could not be more true, especially this week. So talking about the Trans-Pacific lanes, we sort of teased at some of these things a little bit, but there's unrest with the ILA, the International Longshoremen's Association, and that's because their contract renewal. And there's also some specifics that make it a unique contract renewal versus what the West Coast was dealing with. But also the situation with, obviously shippers are shifting their cargo. But then we also had the Panama Canal issue and just the idea of not being able to put the same volume through it because of those low water levels. So the rate is reflecting that, but it's also reflecting other things. And so we've kind of discussed this at global demand lows. Now, we are actually seeing just ridiculously low numbers right now. We were 2 weeks ago, we were at 1,700 a TEU. Last week, we were at 1,400 a TEU. This week, we're getting rates under 1,000. This is crazy. If you can pre-pandemic, don't even add in inflation. It's lower. If you add in the inflation effect, it is wow. I mean, just like I don't even know how they're operating right now.
It's crazy because, like you were saying, into the East Coast, the demand on the lanes, whether it's New York, whether it's Baltimore, whether it's Savannah, Charleston, Port Everglades, the demand on the lane remains soft. It's picking up, and the vessel utilization's improving, and the index pricing has stabilized, but we're seeing more blank sailings that have been announced. So I have a feeling that the rates are going to start to go back up. And what you really said was super spot on, Jay, about Panama Canal, because there's a lot of emerging trends and information coming out right now about Panama Canal in terms of they're going to probably start to implement an emergency Panama Canal surcharge that'll get probably rolled into everyone's, ocean freight pricing into their base rate. So that's something we'll have to keep an eye on.
What's kind of interesting about the Panama Canal is this kind of came out of, obviously this was in the realm of possible. But, if we think about the pandemic and we think about what was happening on the East Coast, a lot of those ports were dredging to be able to make room for these just mega ships. And now it's specifically those mega ships that can't get over there. And that's kind of the catch-22 of the situation,
Yeah. And just real quick, like 30 seconds. So having just been in Panama on business in April, I was down at the canal, and we'll have to upload some of those videos. But, everyone thinks, they open up those locks and the ocean comes running in from the Atlantic and the Pacific and it fills up that canal. And that's not the case because, it was a series of lakes that they dredged. And that's what the fly in the ointment is there, that the water levels, there's been such a drought that they're limiting. I think it's only 32 vessels a week that can transit right now, compared to close to 100 per week that used to transit the canal. Anyhow.
I think the one positive note that we can say about this is, if this situation was happening during the pandemic or during when the whole capacity shift was trying to get out of the ILWU, it would have been substantially more drastic. So
yeah,
we can look at that as like, the timing couldn't be better, having this lower demand. Fortunately, we never would like it to happen. But, that being said, thankfully, we're not in an extreme demand situation, because that would have just taken prices to a whole nother level, which just hurts everyone. So, okay. Yeah. And Anthony, you really touched on some of my notes I've got here as well. This rate is just incredibly low in comparison right now, but also carriers aren't really moving very quickly at blanking enough capacity. So, July, there was a capacity cuts of 7.1%. They announced a 0.5% capacity cut in July, and then a 7.1% capacity cut in August. And this is all the eastbound, our East Coast ports. But then in September, so what we've got coming up, and obviously we're seeing this rate decline steadily, they've only got an announced 1.8% reduction in capacity. So I would be surprised if this isn't revised here in the next coming weeks. We're seeing this rate dive bomb actively right now. So keep your eyes out. If you're shipping this lane, unfortunately, you are dealing with the unrest happening at the ports at the moment. So even though, there is not the demand, you still will be dealing with a challenging shipping environment, unfortunately. So at least you can look at the costs and say, this is fantastic. But
yeah.
Okay, let's see here. Let's touch on our China to Europe lane. We are just soaking up time today. So here's the deal. Actually, when we talk about big movers, generally speaking, the China to Europe lane is not the lane we're talking about with that. It kind of tends to be Old Faithful. But after watching this lane very closely, Anthony and I, for multiple years, it is Old Faithful until we get in these kind of turbulent environments. And then you just kind of see these kind of really unstable bits. And that's actually what we're going through right now in this lane. So, on our last freight market roundup, and actually we've mentioned this a few times, the price has been the most stable in the world for the longest period of time, as it also was during the peak of the pandemic. For the past, about 4 months to 5 months now, it's been between 1150 and 1400 a TEU. But 2 weeks ago, that trend was broken, and this was originally due to a GRI. But the thing with this is it's actually a GRI that's sticking, which we're not used to seeing. So we saw costs go from roughly that 1250, which it was that week, between the 1150 and 1400, as it has been. And then it shot all the way up to 1600 2 weeks ago. And then last week, we saw our averages go all the way up to 1800 a TEU. And there's really no sign of it kind of decreasing in the short term. Now, one of the things you got to mention is that, or I have to mention, is that 1150 to 1400 is well below what it needs to be a sustainable lane. So this could almost be a GRI sticking because it's a correction to, a norm in relation to pre-pandemic levels, right? So still, while this is a lot of money in comparison, it's going back to a norm. Now, so keep that in mind. Anthony, anything you want to mention on that?
No, I mean, you're spot on. Spot on.
Sorry about that. I have my phone on do not disturb, but specific contacts. Anyways,
one of the other things I do want to mention while Jason is checking that out is one thing we want to remind all of our listeners is, Golden Week will be happening from October 1st to October 10th in China. So space is going to be real tight during those 2 weeks. And all of our carriers and what we like to say, our boots in the ground, our partners, strategic partners in China, and our office in Hong Kong has told us that there will be containers rolled. And that's, a 10-day holiday over in China. So adjust your forecasting to make sure if you have urgent shipments that you need to get out before Christmas, you want to start getting them out before Golden Week. And then, of course, before Thanksgiving in, say the first half of November. So your freight can, be here in time for the holiday rush. So I just thought I'd mention that, Jack.
I'm really glad you mentioned that because I had that in my notes earlier and I totally blew right past that. And yeah, like we mentioned as well, obviously we have capacity out there, but those levers are in place. So as a result, you will see some situations if you don't book appropriately. Great, honestly. So glad you brought that up. So let's quick run through our air rates that we're seeing. We'll jump into oil and gas and we will wrap it up today. So one thing to note in general, we are seeing a slightly higher than normal air rates. And this is actually due to there's been some higher temperatures that have been experienced specifically in China, and it's caused some delayed or canceled flights. So when you look at the spot rates from you're looking from Asia to the US, Southeast Asia to the US, China, we're currently looking at an average across U.S. inland terminals up roughly 30 cents from 2 weeks ago. So now our average is at $5.06. The lowest costs we're seeing is if you're shipping into LAX, which would be expected. Those flights are per kilogram for air freight costing around $4.55. Now, if we go over to European partners, we're actually seeing the very opposite effect. So rates are actually starting to slow but steady drop. This generally isn't good because there's a lot of capacity that moves back and forth between Europe and the US, and that massive amount of capacity really keeps the rate very stable. Now, what we see 2 weeks ago, our price averages were at $2.35 a kilogram. Right now, they're below $2.13. So very low costs. If you want to beat that cost, you really got to work with our partner LLS. Our consolidating shipping program is just so engineered specifically to make sure you have extremely reliable shipments coming in the same time every week. And as a result also of this partnership we have with our German partners, LLS, we can control exactly who's touching the freight, how it's packed, making sure there is limited to zero damage. We're opening it up, we're delivering it to you, and they are packing it, and they are really, really, they put a lot of care into it. So, and you also know exactly the people that are touching your cargo, which is great. So if you haven't used our consolidated shipping program from Europe to the US, and you are shipping from Europe to the US, you definitely should try it out. A lot of our customers who use it are just complete fans of it. It's also very cost effective, particularly when shipping from Europe. Anyways, oil and gas. So it has been a moving and shaking week for us, and oil and gas is actually not separate from that. What we have seen, diesel's been heading straight upward over the past couple of weeks. Right now, our averages are coming in at $4.37 a gallon. That is 20 cents up a gallon since the end of July. That's also expected to continue to increase. So keep that in mind. Anthony, any closing notes you have before we wrap the show up today?
Yeah, just one thing. It's not good. We just got an emergency alert. There has been a magnitude 6.1 earthquake shaking the Colombian capital, prompting many evacuations. Of course, Supply Chain Solutions has an office in Colombia with 40 associates. Some of our associates we're on the 25th floor. Some of our associates are now stuck on the 15th floor with some members of our Miami and Chicago team who were visiting down there. So our thoughts and prayers go out to them. There was a strong aftershock, and it's prompting evacuations throughout the capital of Bogota, which is the Colombian capital. So we're sorry to have to bring that up, but we want everyone to know about it. So please keep them in your thoughts and prayers.
Well, make it a great week. Think for us and think also for Colombia in general. Thank you for joining us today.
Take care, guys.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.